and as a part of a community, when we have an adult conversation, we get over our differences. And I think this is the topic of today for our particular session. And it's nicely framed here by I Thou, who was our neighbor. And I'm not going to go into that Martin Buber kind of idea because Bill's going to talk about it. And then we're also going to talk about that. But what I am going to do in this, setting up this adult conversation about community, is saying that we have to have this conversation because the prior question to saying, who is our neighbor that we're building places with? Or are we building places for? There's a prior question of, what does it mean to be a neighbor? That gets translated into then the built environment, the community that functions in the way we put together our streets, our housing, our commercial. So we have to ask this question. So thanks for framing the question, Vince. Thanks for enabling us to be here to talk about it. And then, again, I want to say we would be remiss if we didn't take up the challenge that Vince said yesterday. Let's not be, how do I put this? Let's not be shy. Let's not be timid. We have spent a lot of resources to get here and to have this conversation. Vince is a risk taker. This place comes out of risk. He is bold. So let's have a bold conversation about community. Let's take the risk to put the questions into the room to have a conversation amongst us and all the different types of perspectives that we have so we can move forward, right? So that's the other thing I just want to lay out. That's not to be reckless. There's a difference between reckless and bold, right? So let's have a bold, honest, adult conversation about community. And having said that, I'm just going to make my contribution now, and I'm going to do a couple little vignettes about community and the way that I come at community in two different types of ways. One is as a communicator and as a filmmaker. And I'm also going to talk about an experience I had in Warsaw this past summer. So I'm going to talk about filmmaking, Warsaw, and I'm going to talk about my son's vocational choice regarding community. And I'm also going to talk about the work I do at the Duke Divinity School, where I run the studio for placemaking. So that's 4 little vignettes just to throw out there. And the first one is on civic story. And this is my story about telling civic stories through our company.
Every city, every town has a story to tell, hiding right there in plain sight. Maybe it is touching, historic, or unshakably optimistic. Perhaps it is gritty and self-determined. We find those stories and we tell them for you in film. Whether it's for celebration, revitalization, or promotion. John Padgett began his career creating award-winning films on America's Main Street. Films that helped revive a string of small towns that had been nearly forgotten. He founded First and Main Films with his friend Chris Elisara, an advocate for places people love and the people and communities that build them and call them home. So what is First and Main? It's a street corner in nearly every American city. And it's a film company. We're proudly headquartered in the Rust Belt. But we really live at the intersection of storytelling and placemaking. And at the crossroads of ideas about cities and towns. Ideas about how to make them better. Ideas about how to share their stories. We've done this all over the world. And right here in our hometown of Buffalo. If there's one thing we've learned, if there's one thing we know, it's this. A story can change a city. It can change everything.
So this is what we do. We try the best we can is to bring a story together for a community. We call it a civic story. When you have a story that you identify with, it animates you to contribute to the ongoing future of that community story. But you have to create the story. And the story needs to reflect everybody for it to be a true civic story. And we do that. Let me show you an example of a civic story translated to code enforcement. We got this great call from a city that said, hey, come and tell our story about code enforcement. So let's see how we would tell that story.
My name is Matt Sharaw, Mayor of the City of Monessen. Also, I'm the Assistant Band Director at the high school. I'm a fourth generation Monessenite. I was born and raised here. When I was growing up, my grandma would tell me to just get a job somewhere else and move away. She loved Monessen, but she felt that there was no future here. She didn't want me to stay here, and I flat out told her no. Most of my friends around the same age have left. My parents don't live here anymore. So I'm really the only one. Everywhere I look, I see places that my family touched in one way or another. Where they've worked, where they've lived, where they've shopped. So it's home to me. And I wouldn't be happy moving somewhere else because I would always wonder what it would be like if I had stayed or tried to make it better. I was elected in 2017 at the age of 25. I find joy in this place, and I find our history fascinating. In the early 1900s, Monessen was home to a Carnegie steel plant and also a Page woven wire mill, which made cables for the Golden Gate Bridge and a whole bunch of other major projects. Kennedy has spoken here, Taft was here. So we were an important place. The mill eventually closed in 1986, and that really became a turning point for the city. We kept losing population, losing businesses, losing jobs, and it's been continuing ever since. To give an idea, in the early 90s, we had about 12 to 14,000 people. Today, we have 7,600 people. People left and they moved to the suburbs, or they moved west or south, and we've just kind of been left here to pick up the pieces. With the blight that we have about 400 vacant or blighted buildings, and we saw a need for code. Code enforcement is the city's biggest issue. So back in July, we hired a code enforcement officer. We have made this code enforcement officer full-time, and he's brought in about $80,000 in the last 4 months or so. The last full-time code officer we had, I think it was about 10 or 15 years ago. The city basically hasn't wanted to spend money on a full-time officer. And I think that that's short-sighted, because clearly it pays for itself. The goal is not to raise money. The goal is to compel people to, one, take care of their properties, and then also to compel people to not hold on to their vacant property. People hang on to property for so long, then it's basically worthless.
My name is Todd Carter. I'm the code enforcement officer and building code official for the city of Monessen. I think it's an important thing to have a code enforcement officer to try to keep things from going downhill. And I actually remodeled my own house years and years ago, and I like seeing things that are old and dilapidated and worn out being brought back and rejuvenated. So it's nice to see it, that I can actually make a difference in the city.
I am the 20th mayor of the city of Monessen. My predecessor was basically just saying, tear down the whole downtown. There's no reason to have anything here. He was literally advocating to just level everything.
My name is Joshua Lindsay. I grew up in Perryopolis, Pennsylvania. Oh, I like building every day. I got to stay busy building stuff. When I first started buying properties, I had no clue how to do any of this. I just started learning and asking a lot of questions to people. As you read and learn and teach yourself, you know, you can get anything done. I paid $1,000 for this building. The other guy that was bidding on this at the free and clear auction said he was gonna tear it down. So this building avoided that. This is 361 Schoonamaker. This will be my third project in town. Plan is to redo the front. It's a big storefront. It's got an apartment below and an apartment above. They always have a list of properties you could buy like right now. You just make them an offer.
The city got into this habit of saying, oh, well, we have to demolish all this stuff to attract people, and it hasn't worked yet. So obviously we need a different approach.
My buddy's buying another building, I'm doing another building, and I plan on keeping going, and my buddy's gonna do the same thing. So as that energy starts going, I think it'll get the ball rolling. If I could do what I wanted with this building, I would just get it back to its original, the original pictures of it. From the old pictures, the building was way different than it is today. The keyway is phenomenal. Just the whole building's phenomenal. And to see it like this is upsetting. You know, they want to tear all this stuff down, and you're just tearing down history. You know, the building's been there 120 years or so, and they just want to tear it down, and I don't think that's the right way to go. I think boots on the ground, you know, working, you know, even when I'm walking up and down the street, I'm picking up garbage and stuff. Something as simple as that, you know, if everybody in town did that, the town would be cleaner. I think everybody needs to come together to make something happen here.
What is Monessen? The mill was the thing that everyone was a part of. You worked there in one way or another, or your father or brother worked there. And it was the thing that kind of brought everyone together. And we don't really have anything that does that now in Monessen. I like to think that Monessen itself could be the thing that brings everyone together. I think that it can. I think there are enough people in the city that love the city and that want to see it get better, that could be the thing that brings everyone together. What is Monessen? Monessen is resilient. We're aspiring to be something better than what we are now. What is Monessen? We are literally a city on a hill. A city on a hill cannot be hidden.
So that's a civic story about code enforcement. But how does it work? Did that work for you? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but it works this way. Well, whoops. There was a study that was done at Emory about what makes a healthy individual. When they're 30 years old, 35 years old, they're adult and they're healthy and they're resilient. The study was done. One of the determining factors, variables, is that that adult was told family stories around the dinner table. So the more family stories that you heard around the dinner table determined how resilient and healthy you were as an adult. Story, resilience, health. But it wasn't just any type of story. It was a story that was an oscillating story. You can have stories that are all up, they're all good, they're all jolly. My whole family's jolly, and we got all these stars, and I'm just the next star in the line of the family. No, that wasn't the story that made a healthy individual, because when that individual hit crisis, that story didn't fit. They were the failure, there was nothing to draw back on, because they were not on that ascent. But an oscillating story, when you tell the whole true story of the family, the drunk uncle, the crashed business, and the successful business, and successful family and marriage, that oscillating story is a real story. And when you hit crisis as a young person and as a teenager, you could go back and hear that story, and you go, I am from a family of resilient people. That makes a healthy individual. We thought maybe that's true just for individuals, but is that also true for cities? Yes. When these folks went around 1,000 miles, James and Deborah Fellows, asking what makes a town come back from the brink. At the end of the book, they have 10 factors. Number 3 is that city or town knows their oscillating story. They will say, for the folks in Buffalo, this is my story. Here's who we are. We started here. We came out of the lakes with the original people, put the trails in, and then we had this other things happen, and we fell down, and we made mistakes, and we screwed up, and we're about to turn the corner, but we know who we are, right? If you know your civic story, here's what happens. You believe anew in your place, in your city. You belong to it, right? You belong to the story. And then what you do furthers the story, right? So that you belong to your place. You belong to that story, and you're adding to the story. And we live in a time where, unfortunately, we have more stories than ever, but they're disconnected from place. They're disconnected from your particular place. So we're looking at our phones and picking up all these different stories, but they're not the civic story of your town that you belong to. We've been, ironically, denarrated rather than re-narrating. So one of the things I think we need to do as placemakers and as people of New Urbanists is actually bring really strongly to the work we do a narration of place through story and the civic story that we've been talking about. And the last thing I'll say about this is that, here's how this works. Seaside, invests in the supermarket there, right? Because we know that to have a community there, we got to invest in that supermarket. So we're gonna subsidize that supermarket to make it work, right? And it works. It brings people there and it makes that community with that food. But what we may want to do is actually also subsidize a local newspaper. Why? Because that local newspaper has an interest in who's getting married. And I read that newspaper and I find out who's getting married. I read that newspaper and I find out which kids hit the home run and got through to the next round of the playoffs. That's my kid. That's your kid. That's our neighborhood kid. We find out who dies. We have all our local stories. That keeps us together, right? So let's invest, perhaps, in a local newspaper and subsidize that. And I won't go into any more about that. So that's the first little vignette. Story, civic story. Second vignette, And that's the civic story. Becoming, believing, belonging. Forget that. Forget that. I'm not sure why my... yeah. Forget that. Not working. Not that. Not sure why this is not flicking through. No. Yeah. So the faith piece, this is what I do at the Ullman Center. I'm working on helping churches and Christian community understand place and their role in placemaking. And, I did supply an overview to a big piece of work I'm doing, a field guide to Christian placemaking. Look at that. It provides a whole bunch of information and an understanding of what that work is about. So I can talk about that in the conversation. And then I was going to say something about Wausau. I think I'll save this for the conversation. And I'm going to get other people to add their contributions now. So thank you for your time listening to this particular presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Good morning, everyone. I'm impressed that you got up at 8 o'clock. I thought there might be like 6 of us sitting at one of these round tables this morning. Usually when the religious types are going to speak, the attendance gets low, but thank you for showing up. So I did want to say a minute about the sort of theme as printed in the agenda, this I, thou understanding. And it comes originally from the ethicist and Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who wrote that, forgive me if any of you are Buber experts, I am not, so just feel free to correct me, but who wrote that basically there are 2 ways to view the world. One is from what he called an I-thou perspective, and the other is an I-it perspective. That is, when I engage with you or meet you, I have a choice to view you as either a thou, as wholly other, as complex in your own self, as a unique being, just as I am, or an it, as a means to my own end, as a commodity that I might use for something or another. And that, Buber being Jewish, Rabbi, correct me when feel free, but you see this in Hebrew scriptures, particularly when Moses meets God at the burning bush, and Moses says, well, if I go back and tell the people we're going to go, we're trying to go free them from slavery, who am I going to tell them that you are? And Yahweh says, I am, tell him I am that I am, or I will be who I will be. Doesn't really give Moses much to go on. But it is sort of like I'm not going to give you a functional definition of myself. You're going to have to wrestle with who I am and all that I am, and that's all you're getting. And I think that where this understanding is helpful is, and challenging, is really in thinking about how we as a community, how we as a society, any true community, I would argue, is built on an I-thou understanding. In other words, if you're in a group of people and you have an I-it understanding anywhere in that group of people, you don't have community, period. You're not going to get it. But if you are in a group of people and those people are in an I-thou understanding, you might be well on the way to community. And I wanted to read a passage very, very briefly this morning. My phone will work. That I think summarizes this idea better than anything probably I could say. It comes from the mid-20th century mystic Thomas Merton. He was a monk at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky. And he went and he had this experience, this sort of mystical experience, walking in downtown Louisville on the corner of 4th and Walnut Street in Louisville. And if you go to Louisville today, apparently there's a plaque there. I've not been there myself, but it sort of outlines this experience that he had. It's not a long passage, but I think it speaks to, think about where he is when this happens. Thinks about what he sees when this happens and how the built environment that he's within contributes to this experience that he has, but then also how the built environment isn't enough either. That this experience that he has sort of opens him up to the thou-ness of those around him. So it's not that long, just briefly. He says, in Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut Street, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, and that they were mine and I theirs. That we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious isolation in a special world. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. And then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, their depths, the depths of their hearts where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their reality, the person that each one is in God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. There would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. But this cannot be seen, only believed and understood by a gift. So Merton sort of outlines there a vision of being able to see people, in this case people, but certainly Buber would say it wasn't limited to people, that there's a thou-ness in nature, there's a thou-ness in a tree or a squirrel, anything that vibrates with its own energy, that brings its own history, and that deserves to be respected. And that most of the issues that we have in society result from the sort of relentless ability of ourselves to define one another in an I-it relationship rather than an I-thou relationship. The beauty of the city of Charleston was built on an economics that defined a whole group of people as an it, as property be owned, rather than a thou. And we have to take those dynamics very seriously and recognize that until we get to a place where we're able to see sort of the thou-ness of one another, that any construction or beautiful buildings will miss out on really the gift that we have in one another if we're willing to discover it. So the work I do over in North Charleston, which is sort of like the industrial sister city to all this, is I run a nonprofit organization called Metanoia. We do community development work, run programs for kids, and build affordable housing, and economic development. But really, I think fundamentally, I've been doing it for about 20 years now, so a minute. But really, I see our work, I see my work, primarily as a conversion engine for the broader society, to get people in that broader society to begin to see the community where I live and work from a thou perspective rather than an it perspective. And so often, people come with an it perspective. Even those who are coming to help come with an it perspective. Viewing kids simply for their scores on their report cards, or families as it, as like data sheets. That's how we're going to define the community, and not see the stories, see the human lives that are involved. And I know that if I can get somebody to the community, I've learned over time that if I can get somebody to the community and introduce them to the community at its deeper level, and they begin to see the thou-ness of the community, the thou-ness of the people in the community, the thou-ness of the stories in the community, everything else falls in line at that point. It's no problem getting money from somebody if they begin to see the thou-ness in the community. And if they won't see the thou-ness in the community, this does happen, if they come with lots of money and they are relentless in only viewing the itness of the community, I have learned we do not want that money. Because it comes with too many strings attached, too many agendas, and it won't be sort of a permanent fix. And so my primary teacher Jesus of Nazareth says, in one way that our principal predicament is that we have eyes, but we don't see. We don't see, we look around us and we don't see what we're supposed to see. We don't see what is there to be seen. And I think the question becomes, can we build environments in a way that helps people see? It's not as if the environment itself is going to automatically lead somebody to see. There's other work that has to go on inside of somebody. But I do think that the environment around a person can either help them see or not help them see. If Thomas Merton had left Gethsemane out of a garage in his car and pulled into a parking garage and walked straight into the one store he needed to go into, got back in that car and went back to Gethsemane, he would never have had that experience on 4th and Walnut, where he stood on a busy street corner and watched people walking by and realized all of a sudden that he's not separate from those people, that he's all one of those people. And that experience is available every second of every day to all of us. It's available right now. So look around you. See if you can see what Thomas Merton saw. And think about how that might inform the work we do when we leave this place. And think about who might not be here to be seen, and how they're every bit as deserving of that same vision as anyone who is here to be seen. Amen. Rabbi?
Rabbi Yossi Refson, thank you.
Good morning. There is an old Hasidic story of the Baal Shem Tov, who was a 16th century mystic and rabbi. And he was approached by one of his disciples who asked him that he'd read in some of the mystical and Kabbalistic books that through spiritual refinement, one is able to reach the celestial realms, one is able to see celestial beings, one is able to connect with the prophets, Elijah, with angels. If that is possible, and if his teacher would explain him how to do that. And his teacher said, yes, you're definitely a fitting candidate for this. He said, I want you to spend the next 6 months in prayer, fasting, and study. And at the end of the 6 months, he goes back to the Baal Shem Tov and says, now, he says, we're coming towards the holiday of Passover. I'm going to send you to a remote village somewhere. On the outskirts of that village, you'll see there'll be a little hovel. You'll spend the holiday of Passover in that hovel, and during that time, you will experience this revelation, you'll experience connecting with an angel. So it's great. So I just want to warn you, it's a very poor home, so make sure to bring all the provisions that you need for the holiday as well as for the family, because you're going to be alone over there. There'll be nothing there. So he travels to the village. He finds the hovel on the outskirts of the town. He knocks on the door and he says, can I spend the holiday here? Can I spend Passover here? And the woman answers, says, yeah, I'm a poor widow. I don't really have much food, but you're welcome to stay. He says, don't worry, I have everything you need. So great. He spends the holiday of Passover, the 8 days of Passover, 7 days, and then the extra day afterwards. And he's waiting for this revelation. It doesn't happen. He goes back to his teacher disappointed, and he said, I didn't see Elijah. I didn't see these celestial beings. And his teacher said, you didn't try hard enough. He said, spend the next year in spiritual preparation. He does the same thing. He goes back to the little hovel on the end of the town. He brings all the provisions. He spends the entire Passover there. This time he doesn't sleep because maybe he's missing it during the night. Again, nothing. He returns, and by this time he's frustrated. And he turns to the Baal Shem Tov and says, I didn't have any of that experience. He says, you weren't listening and trying hard enough. Do the same thing the next year. And he does the same thing the next year. He does this preparation. He travels to the house. He's about to knock on the door. And he hears crying from inside. And it's the children that said, Passover's coming. We don't have food to celebrate. We don't have clothing. We don't have firewood. We don't have anything that we need. How can we celebrate the holiday? And he hears the mother saying, don't worry. Last year, God sent us an angel who helped us out. The year before, he sent us an angel that helped him out. This year, he'll send us an angel as well. And then he realized what his teacher was teaching him. That to be an angel is not about growing wings on your back, but it's about having the ability to feel the pain of another person. It's about being able to reach out and help another person and find somebody else's distress and find place in your life to cover that. In Jewish tradition, the sequence in the Bible is extremely important. And the Bible starts with the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, the story of Adam and Eve. Man is created in the image of God. The story of the Abraham, Isaac, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, leading to the slavery in Egypt as a prelude to the revelation at Sinai. Why is it that way? The Bible tells us very clearly. The revelation at Sinai is teaching us how to care for a stranger. You shall care for a stranger because you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. That in order to accept a revelation, the divine revelation, one needs to have the ability to be able to understand the pain that another person is going through. Why is Israel considered holy in Jewish tradition? There is nothing inherently holy about that land. It's the land which has neighbors that have oil and they have oranges. You know, the Jews say we should have got the oil and not the oranges. There's nothing inherently holy about Israel. What's holy about Israel is it's the first place where God commanded for people to live ethically, how to own land. That land ownership, the land does not belong to you. You are custodians of that land. The fields do not belong to you. You're not allowed to plow the corners of the field. One of our sacred objects in the liturgical services is the talit, the prayer shawl, which has strings on the four corners. And we cherish it, and people think, well, what's its inherent value? There's nothing holy about a prayer shawl. The prayer shawl just reminds us of the biblical commandment of how to plow one's field. That in biblical Israel, one was not allowed, the most efficient way to plow a field is corner to corner, up and down. The quickest way to plow a field is in a circle, but the problem is you leave the corners. The Bible tells you that you're not allowed to plow a field from corner to corner. You have to do it in a circular motion in order to leave the corners for those that don't have. So our holiest object, the talit, the prayer shawl, is purely a reminder of how to plow our fields, is to remember to leave the corners for others. And perhaps if we're able to integrate these ideas into our lives, not only will we help others, but we'll help ourselves. When I came to the United States from England at 18 years old to study in seminary in New York, I had the greatest lecturers, but probably the greatest lesson I learned was from a baker who had a Lowen's Bake Shop on Kingston Avenue in Brooklyn. And he would always tell this story. He told of how he was 14 years old and he was being transported to Auschwitz in a cattle car. And it turned dark and it was freezing cold. And he started shivering. And he saw at the edge of the car there was an elderly man from his village who was shaking with cold, was shivering. So he walked up to him and he put his arm around him and he started rubbing him, massaging him, begging him to hold on. And this went throughout the night. He was rubbing his neck and his arms and his back and begging him, please hold on a little bit longer, please hold on. And as the sun came up, the cart started to warm, and he looked around and he saw that they were the only two that had survived the night. He said the old man survived because somebody was warming him. He survived because he was warming someone else. And perhaps this is what the Bible teaches us, that yes, God tells us to warm somebody else, but not because we're a good Samaritan, not because out of the goodness of our hearts, but if we're selfish as well, we'd learn to love another person as well. Thank you.
Karen Prolick, you're going to bring it, right?
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Karen Prolick. I am the co-founder of a company called Opticos Design, which is an urban design and architecture firm. We are based out of Berkeley, California, and we do walkable neighborhood design. That's what we've been doing for over 20 years, designing and trying to provide housing and community for people across the country, like many others here today. So I am not a reverend, I am not a rabbi. I was invited to fill in, given the couple of people that couldn't make it today. But I am a storyteller. That is a big part of what I do. One of the things that our firm, we created a concept based on new urbanist principles called missing middle housing. And we took a key part of what makes walkable neighborhoods work, about what makes our historic neighborhoods work, which are our small multifamily housing, our duplexes and our fourplexes and our bungalow courts. And we created a story around them, and we started talking about them as a really important part of our communities. So I start increasingly every presentation that I give with a story. So I'm going to tell you the story that I most typically start with. I live in a wonderful city. I live in Berkeley, California. Now, I guarantee when I say that, every one of you has a picture in their head about stories they've heard about Berkeley, California. Well, here's my story. It's a wonderful neighborhood where I have raised my children. It is full of neighborhoods, of housing and tree-lined streets and sidewalks. I ride my bike to work every day. My son rides his scooter to middle school every day. We have block parties from Memorial Day until Labor Day, where we close off the street and we play in the street. I'll bet none of you, that was the story you thought of when I said I was from Berkeley, California, right? But it's wonderful. It's a wonderful place to live. 3 blocks from me lives my son's kindergarten teacher. And she lives 3 blocks from work. So she can walk to work every day. She lives with her husband, who is my son's middle school PE teacher, 2 public school teachers. He lives about 6 blocks from work, so he can also walk to work. And they live with their 2 young children, and they live in a triplex. It's a house that looks like a single-family home. You can't tell the difference if you walk by that it's not a single-family home, but it actually has 3 units in it, and they live in one of them. In the second unit is her brother, his wife, and their 2 young children. And then the third unit is her mother and father, and her mother is also a kindergarten teacher at my son's elementary school. So 3 public school teachers, 3 generations, 3 families living within walking distance of work in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the country, right? This is the housing that makes our communities work. These are the types of buildings that provide the diversity of housing, the different ways of living for our increasingly diverse housing, and increasingly diverse communities and family types in our country. So I thought I'd share that with you as how I often start storytelling. But I want to go a different direction for a few minutes. We were asked by Anne to submit a reading or something that inspires us for this gathering today, and I didn't do it. I thought of something, and I was a little bit concerned about sharing it, so I didn't. Well, evidently, life had other plans for me, and evidently I was meant to share that, so I'm going to share it. There is a TED Talk by a woman named Valerie Kaur, K-A-U-R, and she talks about love as a revolutionary act, that our job in life is to be revolutionaries and to bring love to our neighbors. And her story is that she is a woman of the Sikh faith, and the Sikh faith, revolutionary love, is at the base of their faith. And a man that she calls uncle was the first man killed out of hate after 9/11. And he was a gentleman of the Sikh faith who wore a turban, who she describes as being representative of their commitment to serve. That's what it means to them. And because of that, he was killed. And she talks about her service going and meeting with this family, and she went to meet with his wife after he was killed. And she, of course, she was 20 years old at the time. She was full of rage, and she was like, she wanted to tell her story. What do you want to tell the community? What do you want me to convey? And this gentleman's wife said, I want you to tell them thank you. And Valerie was like, I don't understand. How can you say that? And she said, 3,000 people showed up at his funeral. 3,000 people. And it was because the local media told his story after he died. The media took the time to tell his story, and the community came out and saw him as a thou, saw him as a person, saw our family, and told his story. And the love that we have received from that, all I can say is thank you, right? This is why we do this work. We do this work to provide housing for people, to provide communities for people, to provide places where people can live, where we encounter every day people that are different from us. And I clearly have a lot I could say about this, but I'm going to wrap with this part before we go into conversation, which is that our zoning in this country was created to separate us. The foundation of our zoning in this country was created to separate and to segregate us. And the core piece of that was using single-family zoning, using detached single-family zoning as a way to create enclaves for white people, middle and wealthy people, where they could live without having to live with encountering people that were different from them. And the way that was done was they created a detached single-family zone where you can only have single-family housing, and then we made sure that nobody except white people could get mortgages. And if you couldn't get a mortgage, then you couldn't buy a single-family home. We tried to zone, the first zoning actually says in Atlanta and in Louisville, there's an R1 white zone and an R2 colored zone. It actually said that on the zoning map. When the courts struck that down, in the case of Atlanta, the Georgia Supreme Court struck down that and said that you cannot segregate based on race. They changed it, but they only changed the names. They kept the map the same. They made it a single-family zone and a multifamily zone, right? Those single-family zones have been used to discriminate, to segregate, and to separate. And here's the problem, is that I believe the root of the problems happening in this country right now, the fact that we cannot hear one another, the fact that we cannot understand one another, is because we do not meet one another. We are increasingly living in separated and segregated societies that has its roots over 100 years ago, that our zoning has enforced and has perpetuated and made worse. And opening up that zoning is what allows us to live in communities where we can encounter people that are different than us, that have different views, different perspectives, different ways of living, different income levels, right? All of these different things, these stories, this is how we get to know other people as a thou rather than an it, is by living with them. And we have to fix our zoning. We have to create communities where other people can live with us, different economic levels, different racial backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. And so our mission in telling stories about missing middle housing and talking about missing middle housing is about opening people's hearts and minds and opening up single-family zoning to allow people that are different from us to live in our communities, but in a way that makes our communities richer, makes our lives richer. As the rabbi was saying, it's not about making their lives richer, it's about making our lives richer. I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for everybody's contribution so far. And, you know, the power of media, we were waiting for the cameraman to get here. He was stuck in traffic, so we lost 30 minutes of this conversation. We can't catch that up again. So, what I'd like to do, though, however, is have you converse with the person next to you for 5 minutes. 2 questions. What did you feel? Talk about emotion that you felt in the conversation. What hit you emotionally? Talk about that. And then secondly, what question do you have that you would want to talk about? So turn to somebody next to you and answer those 2 questions. What did you feel? And what's your question? And we'll come back in a couple minutes.
Hi there. I have a comment to make on where there's this tendency to always, very unrigorous, to put race in everything. So let me explain the 2 flaws. First of all, there are a lot of countries, say Italy, that has neighborhoods where the rich people live and the poor people, and neighborhoods where poor people live, and they're the same race, or last time I checked. So, and the second point, a little more subtle. You know the work of Thomas Schelling? Okay, so we have a scale transformation. Let's put English people and Italian people in a town. And the Italian people have a very weak preference to be, they're not racist, but they would like at least 30% of the people around them to be Italian. They don't mind if the other 70 are English, okay? So we have, and the same for the English. So we had the illusion that the neighborhoods would be mixed, okay? Weak preferences would lead to mixed neighborhoods. No. Mathematically, and that was Schelling's argument, very potent argument, you end up having, over time, neighborhoods that are 100% Italian and neighborhoods that are 100% English. Without any single person being racist, you end up having segregated neighborhoods. So this idea of blaming things on racism, to me, is very passé. It's like 1960 Berkeley or 1960, Woodstock or whatever. So it is not. So there are things that may be due to race, but let's not throw race everywhere and accuse people of racism all the time when it's, we know that there's scale transformation from the individual to the collective. Thanks.
I need to respond to that, please. I wasn't blaming racism on everything. However, racism absolutely was the basis of the zoning in this country that has caused segregation in this country, right? And if we ignore that history, we are ignoring the fact that large swaths of our population, of people in our community, were left out of opportunity, right? And if we think about what that means, right? So I'm not saying that if somebody today zones an area as single-family zoning that they're racist. That wasn't my contention. But it is historically proven that the single-family zones in our country were created to keep Black and brown people out of those neighborhoods. So we have to acknowledge that racism is a part of the history and the segregation in our communities. So the people, Black and brown people, did not have the opportunity to choose. What you talk about is people feeling, the Italians that want to live in a neighborhood that's at least 30% Italian, is wanting to feel like they belong. They want to live in a community where they feel like they belong. We all want to live in a community where we feel like we belong, right? That is who we are, that's what it's about, right? And we don't want to feel like an other. We don't want to feel like an it. We don't want to feel outside. We want to live in a community where we belong. And so absolutely, we want to create communities where everyone has a chance to live in a community where they belong, right? And zoning in our country has prevented that for too many people historically. And it continues to prevent that. And let me talk about how that plays out today, right? So white families were able to buy homes in single-family neighborhoods where black and brown families were not able to do so, right? Look at what the greatest wealth generation in this country has been over the past 100 years. It is real estate. So white families have generationally continued to accumulate wealth over time, most of them because they owned their home, right? Black and brown families did not have that opportunity. And so now we are getting to places where the housing affordability crisis has reached every community in the United States. You can no longer rent on what you make as income for Social Security. Retired families, you know, we're retiring at something like I don't know, it's a crazy, the number of people retiring right now every day is astounding. Half of them have no savings. They're living on Social Security alone. You can no longer afford to rent an apartment anywhere in this country on Social Security alone. It is not the housing affordability crisis is across the entire country. It is no longer big cities, it is everywhere, right? And so now, next door to my house, a young family just moved in. The only reason they were able to afford to move into my neighborhood was because their parents loaned them the money for the down payment. Right? So a black family whose parents were not able to own their home before this did not accumulate the wealth to be able to then loan the money to the next generation to buy a home. So these effects of this zoning are still having effect today, and it's compounding. And if you think about what, and it's still happening. It's happening in the real estate appraisal industry. There's a book by Andre Perry out of the Brookings Institute called Know Your Price. And he talks about how the appraisal industry today is still misappraising homes of the exact same value by hundreds of thousands of dollars of less for black and brown families in this country. So if you do own your home, and you have been able to buy your home since the 1970s, discrimination by race has been illegal for getting a home mortgage. Not that it doesn't happen, but it's illegal, right? So if you have been able to own your home, and now you're trying to get a loan using your home value to say, put your children through college. You want to get a home equity loan and put your children through college. Or you want to open a small business. Or you want to loan money to your children to be able to buy their own home in a community where they cannot afford to live because of the housing affordability crisis. If your house is appraised for $200,000 less, that's $200,000 less that you can use to invest, right? So these are all issues that we have to acknowledge and we have to talk about in order to create communities where then people do actually have the choice to live where they want to live and to find belonging and to find the opportunities that this country promises. This is like making our country better and greater, and we have to face this and talk about it because the results of it are still with us today.
Completely different point of view. Completely different. The reason that people fear others is that an entire generation, my mother's generation, do you realize that the cities were evacuated after 1960 at a fantastic rate? The Detroits, everything, it's amazing. Like I saw that in my own professional life. Hundreds of thousands of people lost a huge amount of value as they evacuated Detroit, Buffalo, and everything else, because they were racist. Because when the blacks started coming in, blockbusting started. So I want to say two things. First of all, racism serves both sides badly, okay, not just black people. Okay, it's served very badly, but there's a memory of the white people out there in the suburbs who say, we don't want this happening again. They were seared by this. There is a memory of the evacuation of the cities. So it's not completely irrational. Okay, they're not people that are just evil. They just say, we don't want that to happen again. And one of the reasons they have zoning is so that things like dingbats don't happen. You know what a dingbat is? Okay, when you talk to somebody about a 4-unit apartment, they don't imagine your beautiful designs that look interchangeably like the house next door. There's something called the Los Angeles dingbat, which is a building that has 4 apartments. However, it's on stilts for parking underneath, with parking underneath. What the new zoning did in the 60s is they did, because it was not form-based zoning, it was actually numerically based. However much you can park, you can build, right? If you park more, you build more. So what happened is this building on stilts was invented, and you can see it in St. Louis right now. You can see mansions sitting on streets, still beautiful, and you say, why don't you live there? What happened to this? 3 houses down is a dingbat, a hideous building that lowered the value of everything. So the other side isn't just eliminating zoning, because if you eliminate zoning, what happens is dingbats. You have to do what we do, what the new urbanists do. You clamp on a form-based code so that the buildings that are the fourplexes are indistinguishable visually from the buildings that are there now. Because if you do one, it'll just blow up in your face. If you eliminate zoning, like what is happening in California, you're just going to create another evacuation of the cities, because those are incompatible buildings. So I want to warn you about this. I also want to make a little case for those who in fact don't want the free-for-all, because they also lost value. And that generation is now disappearing, but you still run across them. I also want to say one other thing about the very last thing you said about units being appraised at 200,000 instead of 400,000. We have worked to eliminate gentrification, okay? I've worked in black neighborhoods, as has Victor Dover, in Winter Park. There's a black neighborhood adjacent to a white neighborhood, and we actually managed by very, very refined floor area ratios to prevent gentrification. Basically, if the black folks sold their houses, the yuppies couldn't come in because they couldn't build a McMansion. We basically depressed the potential value of the real estate, just like we were asked to do to prevent gentrification. And in the final and everybody was for it, in the final presentation, there was a black gentleman in tears in the second row, in tears, weeping. And I said, let's stop this presentation. Sir, why are you weeping? And he said, because my children aren't coming back to live in this neighborhood. I want to sell the house, and I don't want, and right there, 2 blocks away, those houses sell for 400,000, and I can only sell my house for 200,000. And I want to be able to sell my house for 400,000. When I sell it, I'm just a good old American. I want to actually participate in the wealth creation of my house. And those who actually are against gentrification often eliminate the wealth creation of those who live in the poor neighborhoods, okay? And that is something we don't talk about. We don't talk about it. That's what we're also doing. So it's all much more complex than is presented. And my job is always to see both sides. That's what I do in charrettes. It's not simple, and there are no simple answers. And the elimination of zoning in California is going to blow up in 2 seconds if you don't have a form-based code. And gentrification is going to blow up because there are enough people who are pure Americans, who want to actually participate in the appreciation of their house, and they want gentrification. And I don't like it when it's a one-sided presentation, because it ain't true.
Rob, wait, I'm gonna do this. Rob, then you got a microphone, right? You want to go after now? So what you want to do?
I was actually going to respond to Nassim. I was going to respond to Nassim's comment, because I'm also an economist, work with numbers. So this is not getting into the stuff Andres said, but he jumped ahead. I think it's really important that we look at how the math works in these models. So econ, we use simple models as really important simplifications. They create a lot of value for us. So in urban economics, your first year class, you're going to learn the Alonzo Muth Mills model of a circular city. Now, cities aren't perfect circles. And those have really, really clear and stark implications, like the Schelling model that Nassim talked about. So one of those, for instance, is that at every distance from the center of the city, all the buildings will be exactly the same size, height, and age. There'll be no, so any given neighborhood you're in, there'll be no variation whatsoever in the height and age of buildings. And as soon as you start, but we look at real cities and they don't work like this, right? So as soon as you start adding complexity, these things break down. And when we want to explain real world phenomena, like why you get people with different incomes living in the same neighborhood, even though the models say we should all be perfectly segregated by income because there's some trade-off, like, commuting cost is basically the same for no matter how much money you make, you have to spend the same amount of time traveling to your job. We all have 24 hours in the day. It's a great equality. So the implication there is that the richest people will live closest in and the poorest people will live furthest out because the richest people can sort of bid up the price of the housing closest to the center. We don't see that kind of perfect income segregation in the same way that we don't see perfect racial or ethnic segregation. And that's because people have idiosyncratic ties to place, right? So we have these models, they're really useful, I use them, I love them, but I can also sort of speak to the placemakers and the neighborhoods because what is it that we all here are doing, right? We're thinking about creating towns, places that are worth being in. And they aren't, to use an econ term, of homogeneous value. They're not of identical value to everyone, right? Some people really like traditional architecture, and they're going to pay more to live in a place where they can look at that. Some people don't care what they look at. Some people love dingbats. At least one person in this room loves dingbats. And will pay more than the average person to live there. And then we all have very idiosyncratic ties. My brother would like to buy a house on the street where I live so that we can babysit each other's kids, right? That's a highly idiosyncratic tie that you're not going to get out of any model. And so we do get models that give us these broad tendencies. And I think it's really useful to know, hey, there's this broad tendency towards homophilia in neighborhood choice. There's broad tendencies towards incomes, segregating and along such and such a slope, or prices declining with distance from the city center. Those are really useful implications. But when we're actually doing the gritty work of understanding neighborhoods and the people who live in them, we have to go beyond those models and say, okay, what is it that's making it so that we don't get exactly the kind of smooth surfaces and perfect delineations that the math would tell us we get.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, you're next, yes.
Okay, so this is a complicated issue in the country now, and we're all storytellers here, and we're also all friends, and it's almost like a family. And Dan, your husband, one of the architects of my building. Liz, his wife, is one of the judges who chose him. It's a family here. But you did choose my city as one of your examples. I'm from Atlanta. And so I'll just tell you a story. The thing I mentioned yesterday, we call it the Atlanta Way. And it's been primarily, the city's 7.5 million people now, but it wasn't when I was younger. And so there were three primary groups: Black, white, and Jewish populations. And so these three groups, historically for 175 years, with a few mistakes along the way, worked together to keep the city peaceful. And they would meet in each other's homes, and they would switch routinely to do that. Lee, we've talked about, that. Where is Lee? Was Lee in here earlier? So my father was one of those chosen for his generation. Martin Luther King was one of his. They were overlapping. Sam Massell, Rabbi Rothschild, numbers of people in my city were chosen to do that, and they would switch between each other's homes if something was about to happen in Selma or Montgomery or wherever, that Daddy King, Dr. King's father, insisted happen in Atlanta, that we would not riot. And we did not. We never did. And it was hard work. But going back to what you were talking about earlier, we're also a very prosperous black city. where the city limits itself are approximately 50-50, but it's a very prosperous black community. And in the 60s, they were moving in. That area, particularly in southwest Atlanta, called Cascade. Cascade's very pretty, it's horsey, it still is. And this was a concern to some of the white population there that you're referring to. And so a wall was built across a major artery, Peyton Road, called the Peyton Road Barricade. It was happening at the same time that the Soviets were walling off East Berlin and West Berlin. Not exactly the sort of thing that Atlanta, the city too busy to hate, should emulate. And Walter Cronkite and all the guys moved to Atlanta to broadcast live from this wall. And so my father, who was a public official, was the only person to denounce it. And he was able to do so with the assistance of our former mayor, Hartsfield, at the time, who was his mentor, to do it from the rotunda of the state capitol, because it would resonate from there more. Well, it did. His handwritten speech is still at the University of Georgia archive, but he said, "Americans do not wall themselves off from fellow Americans. Tear this wall down." And they did. But all hell broke out for us after that, and we had death threats and bomb threats and terrifying my mother. And we had cops move into the house to drive my sisters and me to school because we were told we would not return home at the end of the day. And so finally this peters down a little bit after a month and a half, and my parents go off to Highlands, North Carolina to play golf and try to calm down. And the Klan shows up when they're gone. And we're in the house, my two sisters and me, sort of Tidewater colonial building with a stair to go, a second floor porch, very accessible building. And we turned off the lights and we're on the third floor so they couldn't see what we were doing, so we might be able to escape out of a rear window rope ladder. I was 5. We thought they were going to burn the house down. And the police were on short fuse alert. My elder sister could climb anything, and so she got out of this building fast and got to my grandmother's to call the police, who the sirens were blaring. I was 3 rungs down, holding my 2-year-old sister, 3 stories in the air. And so I was hauled back into the house, and they left before the police arrived. I didn't speak for a year. C.T. Vivian, a great preacher and good friend of Dr. King, started lending me his books from his 8,000 volume library. Amazing man. When he died, Governor Kemp of our state allowed him to, the only unelected official to lie in state in this Capitol Rotunda, the same room from where my father made that speech decades before, and of that library that he was lending me books from, because I was still reading, we were able to announce that he had given my foundation his entire library at his funeral in the state capitol rotunda. 18th century, blacks weren't supposed to read, much less publish. And so that great library will go to Cook Peace Park that I was showing you yesterday. It will be housed there. We're the National Monuments Foundation. That community, Vine City, where we've placed that park, is underserved. And yet they embraced us because we are the National Monuments Foundation, and we would record
Who was there? Dr. King lived there, Senator Bond, Maynard Jackson, a lot of black leadership. And they expected to be gentrified out. But over the years, we have gotten to be friends. It's personal. It's all personal. And we were able to compel our former mayor to freeze their taxes. And so now their homes that were only a few years ago, $25,000, $35,000, are now $1 million as of now. And they can stay there as long as they want and not have a tax problem. They won't be forced out, and if they choose to sell, they will be millionaires. This is what we call the Atlanta way. And so this is my story to complement yours and Andres' beautiful story.
Thank you. Thank you. So we got I got the word. I think we can do 15 minutes. We're gonna run a little over, so we got 15 more minutes. Let's keep our comments. We got that right. Go.
Let's hope I can make it fast. If I say something offensive, please blame it on English as a second language. Podium?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I like to be able to hear.
I said if I say something offensive, please blame it on my English as a second language. Rodney's story was incredibly humbling, and probably nothing I say will be as good as that. I want to refer to Karen's comment of someone having to second mortgage their house to pay for college. Things should not be that expensive. We have to pay $300,000 for college because money has been losing value for a long, long time. And people have to go to great lengths to secure whatever they have. They go on crazy crypto investment schemes and all sorts of Ponzi's because they need to have their money grow so it doesn't lose value every year. 10% this year. That's horrible. It is absolutely horrible. And when that happens and we don't have the possibility of having our money grow that much, we hang on to whatever we have with passion and strength, and we do it fiercely. And the more fiercely we hang on to things, the more apprehensive we get when there's someone coming to the neighborhood and getting a new house next to ours, or anything that resembles that. And that's where the tensions come from, I think. That is why we feel like there may be simple explanations to, yes, this is a black or white thing. And I'm talking about colors, not about races. This is a black or white thing. But it never is. There's always too many shades of gray that are happening and we are not really looking at. The real elephant we need to address is the debasement of money. Our money is losing value and people are having to go to these great lengths to hang on to whatever they have. That is the big elephant. That is what we should be addressing. That is what we should be crazy looking for off-ramps and crazy looking for things that we can do to stop that. Inflation is the cruelest of taxes and is the most regressive of taxes. People who have money and they have to pay, I don't know, $20 for a steak that they used to pay $10 the week before, it doesn't matter. If a family needs to buy food at the supermarket and the bill is $80 as opposed to $50 that was last week, many families cannot afford that. I come from a place that sadly suffered from hyperinflation. I remember going to the supermarket on a monthly basis and seeing things that had doubled in price. and having the choice of what to eat being taken from you because money loses value is a feeling that me as a probably 15, 16-year-old boy was not great. At that point, my interests were probably purchasing CDs with whatever allowance they gave me. But it's just, it is brutal on families. I've seen that happen. I've seen the economy collapse. I've seen things that I do not want to say. I see this in my new country, that I love so much. But it may happen. It may happen sooner than we think. And that is, yeah, like I said, that is the big elephant we need to be taking care of. It's inflation, the debasement of our money. That may be outside our circle of happiness that Andres was referring to yesterday, but let's make it our circle of responsibility, because that is something we need to talk about.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. This was my favorite panel so far. I'll try to be brief. I do have a comment for the panel, but I do want to honor and acknowledge the trauma of living in hyperinflation situation, but that is not our situation. You know, fireworks can trigger the memory of being bombed, but that doesn't mean that the fireworks is being bombed. Inflation is not actually bad if most of your wealth is debt. And so what I mean is, picture yourself. Here you are yourself. You're a professional, especially if you're able to set your own prices. You're an architect. And you own your home and you have a fixed rate mortgage. Inflation is making you richer every day, and it is robbing your lender, which is what you want. That sucker that loaned you money, that is the guy that's hurting. Most Americans mostly have debt. So this pitch that inflation is the worst thing that ever happened to us, it's definitely bad for some people who don't, who are working minimum wage in a state that won't raise minimum wage. But for a lot of Americans, it's really not the worst thing. If you have a student loan, if you have a mortgage, fixed rate interest, it actually has benefits for you. But to the points that were made on this panel, one, I actually really do want to know about your Warsaw angle. I wish we would have time to come back to that. So one of the things we're talking about is that, a lot of people want to get closed in, and they don't want even crowding, right? Sometimes they don't want people that are different from themselves, and sometimes it's even just as simple as they don't want other people. We encountered a guy yesterday who was like, oh, don't build apartments, here, it's already so crowded. People just don't want to deal with the physicality. Okay, so then what? How do you say to somebody, you're wrong? I see that you don't want strangers around, and you saying that makes me think you're a jerk, or like, you're just wrong. Like, how do you say that to somebody? Because my proposal just then, I don't think works.
Just a thought, it just sort of might apply to this gathering, maybe. So the years ago in the United States, a lot of states started extension services, like the universities. There's a Clemson Extension Service here in South Carolina. How did the extension services, so one of the missions of extension services were to teach people farming practices, right? And they knew that they couldn't, or maybe they learned very quickly, that you couldn't take Joe Professor, knock on Farmer Bill's door and say, you need to change your agricultural practices here, Farmer Bill would be like, thank you very much. I've been doing this. My grandfather did this. See you later, Professor. Go back and teach your students. So what did you need? We have one on Highway 17. You go past Charleston. You needed demonstration plots. You needed places that you could bring farmers to that people could see, oh, there is a different way, and it's not nearly as scary as I thought it was going to be. You needed sort of like if you want to be theological, you needed incarnation. You needed to see it in the flesh somehow. And I think that, it's big changes always start with small changes, and I just want to sort of affirm that, if we can find some demonstration plots, maybe that's one way to start.
Any other thoughts? And then we're going to go to your comment, and then I'm going to wrap it up with Walsall.
Well, just to close out Sonia's question, because I'm looking forward to hearing from Michelle. I'll tell you 3 ways that we talk to people. First of all, my understanding when Sonia told me that story yesterday is she actually had a great response, which is she just asked him more questions, and she got into conversation with him about it. And he actually backed off his position after she just started talking with him about it, right? That's kind of the point, is like when we live with people, we have time to talk with them about things, and we have time to talk with them in low pressure situations when nobody's holding a microphone and tensions get high, right? Like we live and encounter one another. And that's sort of the storytelling that we go around and we talk about, is we talk about, well, where are your children going to live when you want your children to come live in this neighborhood, because they can't afford to live in this neighborhood anymore. So wouldn't you love to have your children and maybe your grandchildren living nearby, right? In other communities, we get pushback about that. We have had communities we've worked in that said, they're on their own. Like, I still want my neighborhood the way I want it. And we say, well, where are you going to live when you want to stay in this neighborhood, but you don't want to take care of this big house anymore, right? Where you don't want to take care of this big yard anymore. You just want a smaller place, you just want a smaller yard, but you don't need this giant place. Where are you going to live? How are you going to stay in this community, right? There are ways of telling stories and talking to people about what's going on in their lives that actually do open their hearts and their minds to the possibilities. So, but Michelle.
So the title of this session is Who is Your Neighbor? And I just wanted to remind us that language matters. So the term was used pure American, and I wanted to ask the question, if my value system is different and my motivation in selling my home is not profit maximizing, or my belief is that the only use of my family's land here in Mount Pleasant is not just best and highest use as historically defined, does that make me an impure American?
Who's the judge of that? How do you feel about? Answer the question. Yeah. How do you feel? What's your response to that question?
Well, my response to that is that if we think of our neighbors in terms of who's pure American versus who's maybe an impure American, you know, it assumes that we all have the same value system and the same motivations for why we sell property or why we hold property or why we hold land. And so I just think that if we're not going to other one another, and if we're going to think of one another as our neighbors, we have to be cognizant of the language that we use when we're talking about people whose value system may be different than our own.
Yes, please. Yeah.
The entire idea of property rights and property rights protections are that we all have our own independent motivations for why we would hold property, maintain it, sell it, keep it in the family. That is why those protections are enshrined in our founding documents. There is nothing more American than holding property for your own independent purposes, separate from what you think anybody else might expect of you. That is what it is to be an American, is to have that property and have it be yours without any concern for what anybody else would expect or want you to do with it. That is America, that is being an American, is owning that property and being an independent soul. That, as a property rights advocate, is what I stand for every day. And I, terminology aside, there's nothing more American than having your own independent desires for what you would do with your property, and to keep it in your family or to sell it or to do anything else with it. That's property rights.
And that's what conversation does. It asks the question, we get into the conversation, we get to the gray areas, and we talk it through, and we come to understand the other. And we come together in that conversation. And I'm going to wrap it. What's that? Oh, Tom,
what I'm
come ahead.
thinking about
Yes,
is
please.
my sister just sent me she had a conversation with someone who had ethnic, they were Scots, and they had looked at the nature of the Scots that came to America, and I haven't checked out and verified this, but I understand that the first Graham that came to America came as an indentured servant on a boat landing in Charleston, and he eloped with the captain's daughter and didn't serve out his indenture. But from what the story was, that most of the Scots
were shipped over to the New World as indentured servants. And indentured servants had a term. They weren't for life, but the people that had them had control of them, and they were slaves until they served out their indenture. But the slave holders, or the indenture holders, would work them to the bone. So, because they didn't have any residual right to them. So many of us that are might now be considered pure Americans, that's a joke, that we were slaves. And most of us, of whatever ethnic, racial composition we have, our ancestors lived a much rougher life than us today, and many were slaves. So they're pure Americans, they don't exist. I don't think.
Yeah, point taken, thank you. I'm gonna turn it back to, thank you all for our conversation. Let's keep it going.
Thank you, Chris. I have a few instructions about the tour that we're getting ready to go on, but I would like to say just a few things. One is to expand on the very good history that Karen gave, and I'm a little hesitant to do that because I know we have some authorities on zoning history and the rules in the room. Nolan, he'll expand on that later. The Euclid case, the famous Euclid v. Ambler case that we'll be talking about later, that's Euclid, Ohio. And it's just east of Cleveland. And that zoning ordinance that was brought down to Charleston by one of the people who came up with with zoning. That's Morris Knowles. And so, you know, sometimes you see this bumper sticker around Charleston sometimes, go back to Ohio, because we have a lot of people who've moved to South Carolina from Ohio. I want to send that disease in the public mind that's come to be back to Ohio, that zoning back to Ohio, because that's what it is. And I feel like it's, you know, we talk about the I, it, I, thou, and Karen mentioned that we have this land use code that considers things like individuals and homes very emotional things. The it, you know, that's what it's collapsed to. It's just it's, you know, units per acre. And we can do better than that. Same with transportation. I sometimes think that, and I've walked that road, I've hiked that road between Jericho and Jerusalem that King talked about. That's a narrow road. It's a very slow-moving road, and I sometimes wonder if, you know, if the setting could take place on US 17, you know, would the Good Samaritan have even seen the beaten-up man in the ditch? So we need to rethink about and pour in the love on our codes, our land use codes, and our transportation codes to accommodate the other. So, you know, love-based versus fear-based is what I'm suggesting. Now with that, we'll end. Thank you to all our provocateurs who came and everybody that participated in this discussion. We get a round of applause for y'all coming.